Now that the walls and ceiling were wrapped up, I could finally get back to doing some woodworking and work on the cabinets for the van.
Nice.
Before getting to cutting, I started in SketchUp and modeled a rough idea of the cabinet layout. And there'd be a few different cabinet units, including an upper cabinet over the bed, a kitchen island cabinet, and a larger bank of cabinets, including another upper cabinet, a set of drawers, and a cabinet to house the toilet. So I got started with the upper cabinets, which were definitely the trickiest of all of these cabinets, since they needed to conform to the curved surfaces of both the walls and ceiling of the van. I used 1/2-inch plywood for the sides and bottom panels and started by cutting one of the sides to rough size, which was 15 inches by 15 inches. I then brought the side panel into the van, squared it up with the ceiling, and then marked out a few lines with my scribe tool. After marking the lines, I brought the piece over to the bandsaw and made the cut. As expected, the back edge fit pretty much perfectly, and I could repeat the process to scribe the top edge of the panel. I also went ahead and notched out the back upper corner of the panel to provide some clearance for all of the wiring running in this area, and this notch will be covered by trim later on. With that done, I could test fit the panel, making sure to check it in a few spots since the van walls were far from perfectly flat, and overall, it looked good. I cut the rest of the side panels to rough size off camera and then taped all the pieces together, including the template piece I had just cut, so I could cut all the parts to their final size in one go. Before removing the tape, I also needed to cut a few notched areas for the 1x4 stretchers, which would tie these panels together along the top and back of the cabinets. Once the notches were cut, the side panels were done, and next I cut the bottom panels and 1x4 stretchers to length at the miter saw. And I was building 2 upper cabinets here, so I needed 6 stretchers and 2 bottom panels in total. Next, I unwrapped my side panels and started assembling the first upper cabinet, and I started by nailing the stretcher to one of the notched areas. Also, a little pro tip I picked up from my buddy Jason Hibbs over at Bourbon Moth is to use one of these old school wooden hand screw clamps to help hold your panel vertical, square to your workbench, and this really helps when assembling cabinets by yourself. After gluing and brad nailing the stretchers, I came back with some 1¼ screws to reinforce these connections. And I definitely built these cabinets stronger than your typical cabinet, since they'll be subjected to a lot more vibration and movement than something like a kitchen cabinet or built-in. After assembling the carcass, I got a final measurement for the width of the bottom panel, ripped that down at the table saw, and then glued and nailed it to the cabinet. I removed any glue squeeze out, checked everything for square, and then I could add the center dividers. The easiest way I've found to do this is to add a few scraps of the same material in your opening to represent the dividers, and then take a measurement. And this works much better than just trying to subtract the divider thickness, since the actual thickness of these pieces is usually some crazy specific 32nd of an inch measurement.
Perfect. Excellent.
Once I had my number, I could get some layout lines marked out and get the dividers installed, again using brad nails followed by screws. Also, these cabinets will be painted, so I wasn't worried about screw holes since they can be filled with wood filler later. Once the cabinet was assembled, I could test fit it in the van, and thankfully, it fit great. I also went ahead and marked out the locations of the furring strips so I could pre-drill some mounting holes to make mounting the cabinets later easier. With the first upper cabinet looking good, I went ahead and repeated the process for the other upper cabinet, which went smoothly. While I'm working, let's talk about the sponsor of this week's video, BetterHelp. BetterHelp is the world's largest therapy service, and best of all, it's 100% online. With BetterHelp, you can tap into a network of over 30,000 licensed and experienced therapists who can help you with a wide range of issues. To get started, you just answer a few questions about your needs and preferences in therapy. That way, BetterHelp can match you with the right therapist from their network. Then you can talk to your therapist however you feel comfortable, whether that's through text, chat, phone, or video call. You can message your therapist at any time, and you can also schedule live sessions whenever it's convenient for you. If your therapist isn't the right fit for any reason, you can switch to a new therapist at no additional charge. With BetterHelp, you get the professionalism you expect from in-office therapy, but with a therapist who's custom picked for you, along with more scheduling flexibility and at a more affordable price. To get 10% off your first month with BetterHelp, visit betterhelp.com/craftedworkshop. That's better, H-E-L-P. Thanks again to BetterHelp for sponsoring this week's video, and let's get back to work. The next cabinet to work on was the toilet cabinet, and I built this out of 3/4-inch plywood since it'll need to support a drawer that people will actually sit on. Before starting the assembly, I test fit everything because the last thing I wanted to do was glue and screw together a cabinet where the toilet didn't fit. And that's a little bit of foreshadowing. With the test fit looking good, I assembled the cabinet, again using glue and brad nails to start, and then reinforcing everything with screws. I used stretchers for the back and bottom, but used a solid panel for the top since it'll be partially exposed in the finished installation. Once the cabinet was assembled, I worked on the drawer, which was also made entirely out of 3/4-inch plywood. After assembly, I removed the glue squeeze out with the straw trick, and this never ceases to amaze me with just how well it works. Next, I did another test fit just as a sanity check, and somehow, the toilet didn't fit now. After panicking for a moment, I realized I could remove the 3/4-inch stretchers from the bottom and add a solid piece of 1/4-inch plywood to the bottom, giving me an extra 3/4 of an inch of space for the toilet. Thankfully, this worked great, and the cabinet should be just as strong since all the forces will be pushing downwards. With the toilet cabinet done, I could get it and the kitchen island cabinet, which I'll cover in my next video, test fit in the van, and everything looked great. So the heavy-duty locking drawer slides are not here yet, but I can at least mock this up. So the toilet will slide out. It's full extension, so it'll be, I think, about right there. And that seems like a pretty good space to do your business. Oh yeah, not bad at all. Let me get my Duolingo out. Learning French on the toilet here. C'est facile ou c'est difficile? Nailed it. All right, I think that toilet is gonna be a winner. I also test fit the extra passenger seat, which will be installed in front of the toilet cabinet, and it also seemed to fit great. With the test fit looking good, I moved on to paint prep, getting some wood filler added, and sanding the cabinets with 180 grit, breaking all of the sharp edges while I was at it. Diane Teresia got the cabinets painted next, and I love this green color they ended up using. It's evidently called Sherwin-Williams Green Onyx. While the paint dried, I worked on the doors for the upper cabinets, which were made out of 3/4-inch plywood since the door panels had to be at least that thick to work with the bloom hinges. I used this bloom jig to drill the holes for the hinges, and I actually think I prefer Craig's version of this jig since the wood chips tend to get jammed up in the bloom jig. I wasn't using Bloom's Inserta hinges here, just their standard hinges, so I also needed to drill the holes for the mounting screws, which I did with a self-centering drill bit. I repeated the process on the rest of the doors, and then I could get the mounting plates installed in the cabinets. Instead of trying to measure the exact location for these plates, I just held the doors in place and marked the edges of the hinge arms. Once those lines were marked, I used this handy little jig to drill the mounting holes, and the Bloom hinges have enough play in them so I could just eyeball the center line. Best of all, my pencil lines were totally covered by the mounting plates, so I didn't have to try and erase them. I repeated the process for the other two doors on this upper cabinet, and then I could work on some hardware that I was kind of dreading, these gas struts. And I've only used these kinds of struts on one project in the past, and I really struggled with them, but this time around was a lot easier for whatever reason. The instructions were a little cryptic, but I eventually deciphered them, and once I got this first gas strut installed and working well, I made some layout notes so I could easily repeat the installation on the other 5 doors. While I had the doors open, I also went ahead and marked and drilled the holes for the handles using yet another jig, and if there's a moral to this story, it's that you can never have too many jigs when building cabinets. I repeated the process for the other 2 doors, and once all the hardware was on, I could test the doors, and they worked perfectly. Also, these gas struts hold the doors shut well enough that I don't think any additional latches will be needed, but I guess we'll see. Smooth! I got the doors installed on the other upper cabinet, and then I got all the doors removed so I could prep them for paint, once again sanding everything with 180 grit sandpaper and filling any spots that needed it with wood filler. We added 3 coats of paint to the doors, sanding after the second coat, and I'm extremely impressed with how well this paint laid out after rolling it on, since I'm not quite set up for spraying paint here at the new shop yet. The heavy-duty slides for the toilet cabinet had arrived, and these are rated for 250 pounds and lock in both the extended and closed position, so the toilet won't be sliding around while people are doing their business. These slides needed 3/4 of an inch of clearance on each side of the drawer, instead of the more standard 1/2 inch for your typical side mount slides, and I used a total of 5 mounting screws on each side. I added 1/8 inch spacers below the drawer and then got it installed, and you'll notice that the drawer slide hardware is actually proud of the front of the drawer. And this is on purpose and will allow me to notch the drawer front so the locking lever will be more easily accessible. Once the drawer was installed, I could add the toilet, and everything looked like it should work great. With that, we were ready to start getting the cabinets permanently installed in the van, and we started with the upper cabinet towards the front of the van. And I used some of these work supports, which definitely helped when getting the position of the cabinet fine-tuned, and once the cabinet was in position, I added some 2.5 inch self-tapping screws to lock the cabinet in place.
That's going anywhere.
I repeated the process for the other upper cabinet, and this cabinet happened to land on the L-track we had installed previously. And I considered using the L-track to mount the cabinet, but it honestly seemed like more trouble than it was worth, so we just used more of the same self-tapping screws.
Think that's strong enough?
Next, we could get the doors reinstalled and adjusted, and I've got to say I'm really happy with how these cabinets look, especially considering how basic they are with no edge banding or anything like that. Also, these gas struts work great, and I probably ended up ordering too strong of a strut, but they do open the door automatically and keep the door securely shut in the closed position. Next up was the toilet cabinet, which was extremely simple to install in comparison. We just set it in place and screwed it to the furring strips using more self-tapping screws. Once it was installed, I could test the capacity by standing on the drawer, and it seemed to hold just fine.
I think that's strong enough. Wow. That's crazy. That's strong.
So I'm going to wait to install the drawer front until after the flooring is in, so I could call the toilet cabinet good for the time being, and move on to the last cabinet on this wall, the center drawer cabinet. And I had to wait to build this until the upper and toilet cabinets were in, since it needed to be built to fit, and I got started by ripping some 1/2 inch plywood to rough size and then scribing it to fit the curvature of the wall. Once the sides were looking good, I got the cabinet roughly assembled, again using stretchers rather than full panels to save on weight where possible. Also, I've got to say, it is insane how much faster it is to build paint-grade cabinets, since you don't have to worry about dealing with things like pocket screws or dominoes. You can just kind of run and gun and add wood filler later on. Once the basic carcass was assembled, I test fit it in the van and was running into some interference, keeping the front edges from lining up. And after scratching my head for a minute, I realized one of the Wago connectors had ended up behind the cabinet, and once I moved that out of the way, it fit great.
Fucking Wago. I think that was it. I'm like, why is this damn thing not going in? There we go.
With the test fit confirmed, I got the center shelf added, and there will be a door above this shelf. The right side of this cabinet is also where the light switches and GX touchscreen will be mounted, and this will act as kind of a command center in the van. I added another stretcher under the shelf to give myself another mounting point for the cabinet, and then I could get to work on the drawers, making a few measurements based on the actual cabinet dimensions. These drawers ended up on the smaller side at 11 inches by 16 inches, but I think they'll still be extremely useful for things like silverware, plates, and other small items. The drawer boxes were made out of 1/2 inch plywood with 1/4 inch bottoms, and I cut the parts to size with the table saw and miter saw. I assembled the drawers using nothing but glue and brad nails, and I don't know that I've ever actually built drawers with no screws, but they should be plenty strong, especially considering their smaller size. Next, I got the drawer fronts and upper door cut from 3/4 inch plywood, and this was all a bit of a different workflow for me since I wasn't working off a cut list like I typically do. And I'm not really sure if it's faster versus modeling everything in detail, but for this kind of van project, you really need to work off of real-world measurements due to all the space constraints and weird angles. Once the drawer fronts and door were cut to size, I once again prepped everything for paint with more wood filler and sanding. After the paint had dried on the cabinet, I got the drawers installed, and I hadn't installed this kind of side mount slide in a long time since I've really been favoring undermount slides lately. These side mount slides are really easy to install though, especially the bottom slide, which just sits on the bottom stretchers. Installing the drawer was just as easy. I just added a 1/4 inch spacer below the drawer and then added the screws, extending the slides little by little until all the screws were added. One other thing to keep in mind if you're going to be building cabinet carcasses out of 1/2 inch plywood like this is that most screws included with these types of slides are designed for 3/4 inch material, and you might need to supply your own screws or risk a screw popping through the outside of your cabinet. To install the rest of the slides, I used a few scrap pieces of plywood to hold the slides in place, and these spacers help to ensure the slides are square to the cabinet. And I could just cut them shorter as I moved down the cabinet until I got to the last slide. To install the drawers, I added more spacers, this time on top of the drawer below, and this kept the drawers aligned and spaced them perfectly. With the drawers installed, I could get the drawer fronts installed, and I started by pre-drilling the holes for the drawer pulls. Next, I set the bottommost drawer front in place, with 1/8 inch spacers below the drawer front so it didn't interfere with the cabinet below, and then added a few temporary screws through the holes for the drawer pull. These screws lock the drawer front in place, and I could repeat the process for the rest of the drawer fronts, adding those 1/8 inch spacers between each drawer. Once all the drawer fronts were attached with the temporary screws, I could slide out each drawer and add a few screws from inside to permanently install the drawer front. I could then remove the temporary screws and get the rest of the drawer fronts permanently attached. Once all the drawer fronts were attached, I drilled holes through the drawer box, drilling through the holes I had already drilled in the drawer fronts, and then finally get the pulls installed. And this method of drawer front installation is really simple and allows you to install drawer fronts without any unnecessary mounting holes or double stick tape. Next, I got the upper door installed using the same technique as with the upper cabinet doors. And after making a few adjustments, I got the doors and drawers removed so I could install the cabinet in the van. Thankfully, this went pretty smoothly, and after sliding the cabinet into place, I clamped the front edges together and added a few screws to lock the cabinets together. Once the front edges were locked together, I added a few screws through the back stretchers to attach the cabinet to the van, and then I could reinstall the drawers and door. Also, you might notice the kitchen island is also installed, and I'm going to cover that whole project in next week's video since it's really kind of a project in and of itself. So go ahead and get subscribed and ring the notification bell so you don't miss that video. Also, I'll have links to all the tools and materials I used in the video description below. And last, if you want to support me, I have a Patreon page. You can check out my merch. I also have plans available for a lot of my woodworking projects. Thanks for watching, y'all, and until next time, happy building.